Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. Today we're going to have a look at possibly the most stylish, possibly the cheapest, almost certainly the best value digital mirrorless camera you can buy today. It's this beautiful little thing. This is the Olympus e-p1. This is the camera that started it all. More than any other camera, this was the one that began the digital mirrorless boom. There were cameras on the market when this one came out that you could possibly describe as mirrorless. The Leica M8 and M9 spring to mind, but they were very much speciality market, limited market cameras. This was a mass market camera. This brought digital mirrorless photography to a popular audience. This camera was exactly what the market had been waiting for. It's small, it's stylish, it's almost pocketable, it's a go-anywhere camera. It looks like a film camera. It's very similar in appearance to this camera, the Olympus Trip 35. You can see there's a resemblance in size, there's a resemblance in form, there's a resemblance in shape, and in fact it was modelled on the old half-frame Pen F cameras. This camera was perfectly suited to its time. It was a very stylish beast at the time of its release, and it's still really stylish now. It was released at a time when most manufacturers were making very conventional DSLR type cameras. They had that form and that thinking behind them, and they were very, very capable cameras, but this was the first one to celebrate a sense of style. This was the first camera, certainly of the digitals, to emphasize the fun factor. It looks and feels like a 60s or 70s compact or rangefinder camera, and anyone who knew those cameras at that time, those old film cameras, will immediately recognize a similar form in this camera. It was very stylish when it was released, and I think it's still very, very stylish now. It's a beautiful thing. The body is all metal. It's really well made, and it has this stainless steel front which sort of carries right round the back as well. Stainless steel is a brilliant material. It's very hard wearing, it's very good looking, and it's used to really good effect on this little camera. A really beautiful thing with a real genuine retro look and feel. Like most Micro Four Thirds cameras, it has a range of aspect ratios. It does 4:3, 3:2, 16:9, and the square format, which I do love. I think I've talked about that in the past. I really like the square photo format. And that square aspect ratio I've used to really good effect with this little lens. This is an Ichizuka 25mm cine camera lens. I thought when I bought it was for a 16mm camera, but actually now that I've used it, I think it's probably nearer an 8mm. This little camera makes beautiful, beautiful images. I mean, they'll stand alongside anything that modern cameras will make. The maximum resolution is 12 megapixels. The sensor is 12 megapixels, which isn't a lot by today's standards, but actually you don't really need any more than 5 megapixels unless you're blowing up to enormous proportions. So you won't find this camera really lacking in any of the technical aspects. It's a very capable, very able, very powerful little performer. Now, this is an older camera, so it's a little simpler than some of the later cameras that you'll find, and it doesn't have quite the same amount of bells and whistles that they might have, but I think it has all the important features you need, and you won't find this really lacking. This camera even has mechanical image stabilization. The sensor actually moves to compensate for any camera shake that might happen, and so it does give you 2 or 3 stops of extra freedom if you're shooting in very low light, and that's quite an advanced feature. It didn't appear on many cameras until quite a few years later. It does have some limits. The screen on the back here is a nice big screen, but it's fairly low res. You will notice that difference if you're used to a very modern viewfinder or screen on your modern camera, on your newest up to the minute camera. You will see that difference. The screen itself doesn't articulate, it's fixed in that position. I've not found that as much of a handicap as I thought I would, actually, but there are times when you need that tilting screen, so that is one of its limitations. Now, as well as the lower resolution screen on the back here, this is a camera without an electronic viewfinder of any kind, and worse than that, there's no provision to actually fit one. On the later pen cameras, you can actually pop an electronic viewfinder on the top there. There's a little electrical contact here, and you can use that viewfinder as you would any EVF in any other camera. This camera does not have that provision. I did think, okay, well, maybe I can put an extra optical finder on the top. And yes, you can do that, but you've no way of focusing, and the focal lengths on the optical finder possibly may not match up because they're going to be for the old full frame measurements. So that is a limitation, as is the fact that there's no focusing aid. There's no focus peaking on this camera, and it may be that focusing is a little more difficult than on cameras with peaking or other similar aids. It does have focus magnification, but it's actually quite fiddly to use. So if you're using vintage lenses, the only real way that I've been able to focus is just visually using this screen on the back here. In fairness, that does seem to work pretty well, and it's been a lot easier to do than I first thought. At first I thought, gosh, this is going to be a really difficult camera to use with vintage lenses. In the event, it's not been that difficult. I used this Jupiter 8 on it yesterday, and just simply using the screen on the back here was enough to find good focus. So perhaps that's not so much of a limitation as I originally thought it might be. Also, if you're using autofocus lenses, which do work pretty well on this camera, there is no autofocus assist light, and that actually can make focusing very difficult if you're in dim light or you're in low light. So these are all limitations that this older camera from 2009 has. However, here's the thing. Use it within those limits and you'll be fine. It does feel a little bit stripped down when you compare it to more modern cameras, and that's just part of its nature. It is what it is and it ain't what it ain't. But if you use it within those limits, then it's a really powerful, really nice little camera. It has really nice colours. Beautiful colours, far nicer actually than any colours that I've ever got from my Panasonic Micro Four Thirds camera, the GH2. Olympus have always been well known for their colours, and the old Zuiko OM lenses are very, very nice lenses for colour reproduction. That philosophy does seem to have been carried over into this little e-p1. Images made with this camera have fantastic colours. Really, really nice. I find the colours spectacular. They're rich, they're vibrant, they're pumped up with saturation. I think they're spectacular. And from time to time, some of the images, I don't know if it's me, but they do remind me a little bit of Kodachrome film. So this camera does seem to have been tuned with filmy type colours in mind, and they're certainly colours that bring the world to life. Now, in keeping with its spirit of fun, this little camera has art filters, and they're selectable just by turning this little dial on the top here, and I think there are 8 or so of them in this camera. Some of them work really nicely, others personally I don't find work too well, but there are 2 that work really nicely in my opinion, and those are the pop art filters and the high contrast black and white, which actually I think is called grainy film. It does put a bit of film grain on the images. They work particularly nicely. They're not something you'd want to use in formal work or professional work or any of that type of thing, but they're great if you want to just do a bit of fun shooting. They slow the camera down a little bit. Some of them take a little bit of processing power, and so there's a delay of 2 or 3 seconds after you've shot one. Later pen cameras do this more quickly, but this one, with its first generation computing power, takes a little bit of time to bring those art filters and to apply them to the image. As for lens choices, well, the sky's the limit with this one. There are hundreds of micro four thirds lenses available if you want to stay digital and modern and electronic, if you don't want to use any of the old lenses. 4/3 lenses, micro 4/3 lenses are huge in number, and this one seems to work pretty nicely with most of them. This is on here at the moment is a more or less bog standard kit lens. This is the 14 to 42 millimeter lens, and the camera will originally have shipped with a lens like this. This is a slightly later lens, but the original one is going to be broadly similar, and it seems to work quite well also with the Panasonic kit lens, the 14 to 42 Panasonic kit lens. It works less nicely with this lens. This is a Sigma lens with a linear motor in it for autofocusing, so it does seem to have a bit of trouble with this one, and the later pens, the e-p5 and the e-p8, seem to work really nicely with this one. So there's a bit of a mismatch there, and you may find a bit of a mismatch with some of the more exotic or the newer type lenses, but the vast majority of micro 4/3 lenses seem to work fine on here. And then of course, because it's mirrorless, you can use any of the old lenses also, like this Industar 61 here, or this lovely Jupiter 8 that I've been shooting with recently. The Helios 44 also will mount. Let's put this lens on here and see how it looks. I don't think I've actually put a Helios on this body yet, so we'll see how it looks. The SLR lenses will protrude a little more than the rangefinder lenses on this camera, but actually that's not too bad. It doesn't look too big, it doesn't throw the balance of the camera out too much, and it does look very cool in this silver finish. And it's kind of interesting that the style of the camera seems to work perfectly with these older lenses, or rather with the style of the older lenses. There's not a stylistic mismatch going on there, and in fact if we put on the Jupiter 8 onto this camera, I think this camera works best with rangefinder lenses rather than SLR lenses. The proportions are much nicer, the adapter is much smaller, and this Jupiter 8 could have been made for this camera. It's a similar story with, if we put the Industar 61 on it, we'll see that again, that lens just looks really, really nice on this camera, and it does sort of match the stylistic thinking as well. It also works really well with a lens like this. This is an SLR Magic lens. It's an f1. What is it now? An f1.7. I think it's a 35mm lens. So on the Micro Four Thirds sensor, this will give a field of view equivalent to 70mm on full frame. And this is a really nice little lens. It's coated, it's sharp, and it gives you some really good bokeh effects as well. No shortage of lenses for the Olympus e-p1. Now this camera is a real bargain at the moment, and it may be as cheap as it's ever going to get. I recently paid £50 for this camera, body only, there wasn't a lens. With a lens you might be looking at, I don't know, between £75 to £100, something like that. This camera may be as cheap as it's ever going to get, and if we remember what happened with film cameras, they became very, very cheap. Nobody wanted them at all, and then suddenly they took off in price when people realised, actually, this old film technology, maybe we shouldn't chuck it away so quickly. And I think the same could happen with old digital cameras like this. This is still a very capable, very powerful machine. If you compare it to the latest cameras, sure, it lacks a few features, it lacks a few bells and whistles, but it's no less than what it was when it was new. It still has all the abilities and features that it had when it was new. And I would suggest, if you want one of these, don't hang about, because I think they might begin to increase in price relatively soon. So, a beautiful, beautiful little camera, an absolute pleasure and a joy to hold, to use. It uses a very wide range of lenses. There's no real limit to your lens choice, and it has that classic camera styling as well, which makes it such a lovely thing to look at and such a lovely thing to be around and to use. If you want one, get one. There's no excuse not to. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to help the channel grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very, very much for watching. It really is much appreciated, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.